We're here in Dunolly with Anna and Philip Ashton at their beautiful studio. Do you want to tell us where you were before and how you got here?
You can do that.
I can do that, okay.
Yeah, you can do that.
Well, we were living for quite a few years in and around the Dandenongs outside Melbourne. I was teaching photography at a private photography school and also at the Vic College of the Arts. And what were you doing, Anna?
Well, I was basically working from home as a potter, but also looking after 3 kids. So I wasn't actually out there earning anything other than what I was sort of selling through occasional exhibitions at home, and the local pottery shop down at the basin where I'd actually done my pottery course, which was pretty basic. It was only a few months, but then I'd sort of taken on pottery as a bit of a challenge and was looking at tertiary education, and we decided instead to move.
And what made you choose Dunolly?
Well, the connection with Dunolly was that at one of the places that I was teaching photography used to run workshops up near Castlemaine. And so we'd bring students up to this place outside Castlemaine and be instructing them to go around and take pictures all over the place. And I started investigating and exploring myself with the purpose of taking pictures, and ended up a number of times in Tarnagulla and Dunolly, where I took pictures of old buildings, usually the insides of old buildings, things like churches, and talked to some of the local people. I didn't actually make recordings at that stage, which would have been really good, but I ended up with some quite interesting pictures. So this neck of the woods was quite interesting for me at that point. And while I was teaching photography, most of it was part-time, I was also working as a freelance photographer in my spare time, taking photographs usually for tourism for the Australian Tourist Commission. And I had a sneaking way of, if I wanted to go somewhere, I'd tell the picture editor at the ATC, the Australian Tourist Commission, that I was going to Canberra or where else, all over the place. And any photographs up there you'd like? And he'd say yes, and supply me with a whole bunch of film, as it was in those days, boxes of Kodachrome, and I would have an excuse to go travelling and get paid for the travel. And that tied in with pottery, because one holiday time we were looking at not very much money, and I had arranged a trip north, I think up to Queensland. So I knew that we knew that there was some money going to be coming in, but Anna was making pots, and she was making little tiny pots.
Nearly all of my pottery by then was about 2 inches high. So I had a whole range of miniature jugs, bowls, cups, saucers, lots of just tiny things which people really loved, and which were really easy to put into a styrofoam fruit box and cart around. And Philip used to go to the various galleries and shops and sell them, because I could handle selling at markets, but I didn't really like this selling to shops. And that trip to Queensland, we had one market stall at Mount Beauty the first day. No, Callista Market the first day.
Was first up.
Mount Beauty the following Saturday. And we managed to come home with enough to pay the car payment, the mortgage, and some money left over after 4 weeks on the road. And we thought, well, if we can do it for 4 weeks, let's do it for longer. So we put the house on the market, and
we bought by that stage we had a camper van, so we were familiar with travelling in the camper van. It was a Toyota pop-up camper van, which we travelled with our 3 kids and the dog. And when we thought about this extended trip, we also bought a small caravan. So we had the small caravan and the camper van and this selling of the house, and we thought, wow, we could be, well, we wouldn't have been grey nomads, we would have been sort of fairly dark-haired nomads, and we decided to take off on a trip. And I also, at that stage, was singing songs in cafes and music venues around Melbourne, and I arranged with the guy who was one of the places that I was singing at, the Troubadour, with Andrew Patterson, to give me a list of places that I could hook up on a travel around the country to go and earn money singing songs. So that all looked fairly good.
I had a tiny pottery wheel, which is actually sitting on top of the cupboard over there. A very small kiln, which would run off an ordinary caravan gas bottle, and didn't need much clay. So we could fit the kiln and the wheel in the camper van and set up a studio anywhere I took my fancy, sort of thing. So we started off with a trip to Tassie with just the van and lots of pots, and did about 6 weeks around there, but we're a bit disillusioned with stopping in caravan parks, which, because we had the dog, we couldn't stop in national parks. Unfortunately, the dog met his end, being hit by a car, one little town. But the kids liked the caravan parks because there were other kids to play with. But we got stuck in conversations with grey nomads who would come in every night at 6 o'clock on what we called the Dolphin Parade, because that was the brand of camper van that most of them were driving at the time. So the Dolphin Parade came in at about 6 o'clock, and we'd get our adult conversations, which generally were about the showers.
Washing machines.
And washing machines. And it occurred to us that if we'd sold everything, just to land up in conversations about showers and washing machines, something wasn't going to be terribly interesting. So we came back to Victoria.
And I reckon that was on the ship coming back from ferry,
Tassie,
whatever you call it, from Tassie, thinking, oh, this is really great, but are we going to be just travelling around looking at various caravan sites, and it's not so brilliant. Yeah. So one of the first ports of call when we got back to Melbourne was to visit my sister at Montrose. And we bemoaned the fact that this wasn't quite as exciting as we thought it was going to be. And she said,
"Why don't you get a horse and cart?"
And we thought, oh,
that's a good idea.
Interesting idea. So we checked the Trading Post
and the Age
and the Weekly Times, and
nobody had any for sale.
And we weren't actually sort of really horsey people. Cecilia, my sister, was. She loved horses and always had a horse and rode a horse somewhere all the time. So it was and I did actually travel as a kid. I borrowed the girl across the road's horse, and that was the way I got around for a while. But she was a Shetland. It wasn't sort of really exciting travel, except when the saddlecloth came off one day at speed. But yeah, we weren't really horsey people. But we got pretty impressed with this idea of this horse and cart travel thing.
And the gypsies. So we did a lot of reading about gypsies and the Rom and their history in Australia and things like that. We sort of got quite involved with sort of the things that we were reading. But we realised we were going to have to probably build our wagon, and we thought that might take, well, we thought maybe 4 to 6 weeks to build something and find horses. And we found a friend's place down in Gippsland where we could build said wagon.
Or we could at least stay with them for a bit. Yeah, we could camp there on their property.
And that was what we said to them. Can we come and camp there for a few weeks?
4 to 6 weeks.
It was closer to 46 weeks actually. So I must still look at the calendar and just see how long it was. But we found somebody who could actually do the engineering, and I did little models of what was suitable. Fred, the welder, expanded it. He said you couldn't possibly live in that space, and I wasn't terribly pleased. But what he built us was brilliant, and it didn't weigh as much as it could have because it was all done with tubular steel and beautifully welded, and we did all the fit out and the rest of it.
You did all the interiors.
All
I
the-
helped Fred with
the welding.
cutting of steel and things like that.
If I can ask, what did your kids think about this? How old were they first?
Well, they were 3, 8 and 11 at the start. So
So one of
Tom
the
turned
problems
4
was-
the week
yeah.
we left Braggalong. So that was like 4, 9 and whatever Jono was.
So
12.
we were okay
12.
sort of making the break, but the kids had friends. Tom was probably Tom the youngest, probably was less attached to people around than the others were.
Mostly. Castanian was his
Yeah,
best
yeah.
mate. They weren't overly impressed, but they also weren't overly against it. Especially at the beginning, it was a bit of an adventure, I think. I wonder.
The motorised.
At the beginning, I was also the friendships was the big thing, and Kate had a really good friend who lived across the road, and I was so pleased because they moved before we did.
I would have thought it was a lovely adventure. I would have just been so down for that. In fact, I think I read The Lord of the Rings, and I packed my bags and I went hiking up the road at like 11 years old, going, I'm leaving home. I'm going on an adventure.
Well, Jono left home at Narandra, packed his case, and off he went across the paddock. He was the oldest. He came back. He did learn to drive then. I mean, there were lots of pluses. Yeah, nearly had us evicted.
Yeah.
Nearly had the people who were staying with evicted because
Jono
he
drove across the wheat
the
field,
wheat paddock.
Oh no.
which was a real,
Just the
no-no.
corner, thank goodness.
Yeah.
But
Oh no.
deep shit then.
Yeah, that was a pretty amazing time. We met the folk there, and when we met Don in the supermarket, he said, "Oh, you are coming out to our place to stay?" And we said, "Yeah, that'd be great." And we went out to the farm where they lived, and when we got there, he said, "Oh, I've got to go and catch up or pick up my wife Sue, who's in Wagga."
She was coming back from Sydney,
From
but
Sydney
here
to
to Wagga.
And he said, "Oh, here's the keys to the car," because there was a little car there. And he said, "Oh, and we'd like you to play in the band tomorrow night. So take the car, and it's all arranged." So we'd already met the people at another gig at a pub via one of Andrew's contacts, who'd come out to the pub to meet us, and we played tunes with them. So we'd met a few people in the area who played music, which was great.
What do you play?
I play, at that time I was mostly singing, playing guitar, playing fiddle, and you were playing at that stage?
I was playing whistle and accordion,
Yeah.
mostly accordion.
Tell me a bit more about the wagon adventure. That sounds really interesting. Like, how long did it go on for?
Well, I guess just getting set up was fairly complicated, because we had discovered in Braggalong, which was the town that we were living at the time, there was a guy who was a farrier, and he also had a draft horse. I think it was his.
No, it was Yvonne's.
Okay, but at Chris's place there was a draft horse, and we thought, "Ooh, better go and check out this situation." And so we arrived down there and told Chris about what we wanted to do, and he said, "Oh, geez, Phil, you're going to have to learn how to shoe, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah?" He said, "Yeah, come round tomorrow at 10 o'clock and we'll start." So I did, and I learned how to shoe, courtesy of Chris.
And we used my kiln to make some horseshoes because we
How
had
did
to.
that work out?
It wasn't too bad, but it was pretty laborious. And we only did it, I think we only redid it the once.
Yeah, because the problem was that you couldn't buy, well, it really gets back to the horses. Initially, we managed to buy 2 horses with some advice from my sister Cecilia, and they were quite good horses, but they weren't really up to the job of pulling quite what ended up being quite a large vehicle. And then we bought our first Clydesdale, who we named Sam, because his name at the time was Clumper and we thought he needed a better self-image.
His name was Baldy.
Oh, Baldy. Okay, it was Strider was Clumper, yeah. So we had to make sure the horses had the right names. And so we, by the time we got to buying our first Clydesdale, we realised that getting shoes was a problem, because you can't just go and buy, at that stage you couldn't just buy shoes for a Clydesdale because of the size of their hoofs. So we had to get shoes made or be able to make the shoes. So we learnt a bit about blacksmithing, even though most of the shoes that we got made were by blacksmiths that we met along the way. So that was part of the adventure. And
we had correspondence school work for the kids, and that we only took maths, English and art and craft. Figured most other things they were probably going to learn on the way, but that should keep them up to the basics. And in fact, that was plenty. That was oodles. There was Kate and Jono both had their schoolwork, and it was expected that they would reasonably happily just do sort of an hour or so a day, but sometimes it was sort of major arguments like, how long can it take to write one sentence with a describing word, would you think? But somebody could make it stretch out for hours by basically refusing to do anything. So arguments like that sort of put a bit of a dampener on schoolwork, but they didn't happen all that often. Mostly it was okay.
Did they do the schoolwork while they were on the road, or did you have to do it at night when you stopped?
On the road if we were travelling?
Well, on the road it was pretty amazing, because the wagon had full floating suspension, so you could actually, when we started off in the morning, you could actually put a kettle on the gas stove and happily travel along and make a cup of tea. And it was quite, even across paddocks, it was quite smooth.
I only lost one boiled fruit cake, which was done while travelling.
And how far would you get? Like, how far would you travel when you travelled each day?
Between 2K and 35 was our biggest.
Usually somewhere a little short of 20k.
Yeah.
Which was, we realised, the distance between small towns, where that'd be the distance you could travel on a wagon. So taking things from town to town would be the limit for horses on a big vehicle.
And they used to change horses.
Well, that was more
That
for
was,
the faster
yeah,
travel, like Cobb and Co. would have staging places where you changed your horses. But for the bigger vehicles where you were actually carrying loads, it was about the distance between towns. Like from here in Dunolly to Maryborough is around 20k. So that would be about the distance. And at night, when we stopped, we had a portable electric fence. So we could actually rig up an electric fence beside wherever we were and put the horses out on the fence where they could eat.
Because it was also drought time. It was 1982 drought time, and we were starting in East Gippsland. We had sort of set Queensland as being almost a goal. We had friends at Mullaney in the Brisbane hinterland, and so that was sort of where we were heading, but we couldn't really travel on highways.
Well, we didn't want to.
Well, we didn't. Yeah, we didn't want to, So we had to sort of choose a crisscrossy route, and water was at a premium. Water and any sort of pasture for the horses to graze on. So we sort of did a bit of a recce and decided that the best way to go was from Bryagle on up via Buchan, Bairnsdale, Buchan, and to head to the high plains.
That's where the feed was. We could
Yeah.
get. We thought there would be feed up on the high plains.
Feed and water. And as it turned out, we had water by the time we got there because the drought broke.
Well, we got to Angler's Rest below Hotham. No, Angler's Rest. Yeah, yeah. And friends with a 4-wheel drive actually hauled the wagon up to the top. And you and Diane rode the
horses
two
up.
horses by that stage, because we realised that we needed a second horse when we were in Buchan, and we did manage to find a second horse. And the only problem there was trying to get them to both work together, to pull together. So I'd spent an amount of time pulling logs so that they would actually work together. And we got to the high plains. And the night that we got there,
Great.
the drought broke. And it got cold, and it got wetter and wetter and wetter.
Until we had to bail out. About 3 days.
Of Buchan or of the trip?
Off the high plains.
Oh, okay.
One of the horses was starting to have diarrhoea. They weren't looking very happy. They were cold. We didn't have blankets with them.
Smart.
In the hot weather before that, there was no need for blankets for horses. So we had a space blanket or two rigged, like really thin things rigged over the horses. And you cooked cakes.
And I cooked
to keep
until
us
we nearly
warm.
ran out of gas.
to get us warm.
And
So, yeah.
what did people think when they saw a group of gypsies in their caravan?
Well, we were the talking point in a lot of places, and a common thing that people said was they'd look at us and go, "Oh, that was my dream. I always wanted to do that."
Always wanted to,
Yeah, but I couldn't.
And then the excuses would come out, and but we had children, and we'd look around at the street house and think, yep. Or they'd miss school, and you think, well, there's alternatives, and what the kids were learning.
How old were you when you started this journey?
Oh,
20s?
when was it? 82. I must have been 32. 31.
I must have been 33.
Yeah.
How about that?
So
Couple of years
it's
ago.
interesting to sort of look back and think, oh, that was quite big. Yeah, we weren't really all that old. We were just young and stupid. What really floors me, especially after last summer, with all the fires, the bushfires up through Buchan, W Tree, all up there, we were travelling up that road with no mobile phones. In fact, there was a phone box, I think, at Swifts Creek.
You'd occasionally see people.
There was one at
with a
Omeo
car.
by the time we got there. Logging trucks coming down through the forest there. No means of communicating with anybody. Now, we weren't lighting fires. We were sort of pretty sensible, I suppose, that way. We were only cooking with gas inside the wagon, so there was no naked flames or anything. But if it had been something like last year, we'd have been toast.
There would have been a telephone tree though along the journey.
There possibly would have been anybody who'd seen us, because we didn't travel very far. So I can't
And
remember how
nobody
many
could
days.
miss you if you were.
Yeah.
No.
And people could find us because they'd follow the horseshoe.
Yeah. And how many years were you on the road doing this?
Nearly 3 altogether.
Did you get to Queensland?
Yes.
We
Yeah.
zigzagged
impressive.
across New South Wales.
Rain.
Yeah, and the other thing that happened was we discovered hills, which the horses weren't totally happy with. So when we got to some reasonably significant hills, the horses would stop. And the cry would go out, shock the wheels! So we'd stop, give the horses a rest, and then attempt to start off again, which was okay if both the horses started together. But if one of them started and the other one didn't, that wouldn't work so well. So we learnt a lot about horses, and I think a couple of times I took the horses pulling logs for practice for them. I think I went ploughing a couple of times when I discovered a plough. But we got there. We got up to Mullaney.
They were pretty well working together by the time we got there.
And occasionally, if we did get stuck on a hill and somebody stopped to ask if they could help and they had a four-wheel drive, we'd say, yes, look, we've got a rope we can tie to the
front of
the pole. And they'd say, oh, what about the horses? And we'd say, look, they'd be fine. They love this. They would love you to help. So they would just be there pulling away with a car attached. Happened quite happily.
So you must have met a lot of people on the way. Do you want to tell us about some of the most significant people that stand out?
Oh, Arthur Potter, I reckon.
Tell us about
Arthur Potter.
Oh, yes.
Older guy, like he must have probably
Close
been
to the
60 or
Queensland
70,
border.
Lime Vale, yeah, near the Queensland border. And he said, hope you don't mind me asking, but are you hippies? And I think we sort of said, well, we're not really sure whether we're really hippies or not, but we had quite a long conversation. And he gave us about 24 eggs. He said, oh, I thought you might be able to use these. Well, unfortunately, they were all off.
Were they all off or just some of them?
Oh, I think most of them were. But it was really quite nice and sort of, broaching the question, like, are we these antisocial, dropouts or whatever? But we had a lovely conversation. And it was around there too that somebody drove past us in the morning and waved when we were stopped. And later on that day, she tracked us down, handed me a big ice cream tub full of cupcakes and another little margarine container full of icing. She said they were too warm for me to put the icing on, but I thought you might like these. And things like that would happen.
And the other thing was that a number of times when we were in towns in particular, somebody would come up and catch up with us or say hello and talk to us, and they'd invite us to their place overnight. Which the wagon was so comfortable we didn't really need that, but it was not happened quite a number of times that you'd actually be in their house, maybe cooking in their kitchen, maybe cooking a meal for them, and
ferreting around the drawers for the wooden spoon,
or we'd stay there for a couple of days and they'd cook one meal for us and then we'd cook another one. So you're actually in somebody's kitchen, never having met them before. Amazing.
And we had a couple of long stays, like a couple of months. One was with or on a friend's place or near a friend's place up Mount Beauty, which was where I sort of actually made a lot of pots. We still had the camper van, but we didn't travel with it. We left it at a spot where we'd stopped and made pots. Philip would go off with the van and sell things, come back with the loot. We'd leave the van behind and keep travelling with the horses, and then when we ran out of money or found somewhere that was a really nice spot to sort of spend a few weeks, we'd Philip would hitch a ride back to the van, pick it up, bring back up the gear, and then I'd work my little fingers to the bone and make 5,000 little pots, and off he'd go and sell them again, and we'd go on for the next stage. So
leave the car behind.
Leave the car behind. So that was the story in Narrandera with Sue and Don, who had young baby Phil, and
which is where
we
Tom
still
learned
have
to read.
contact with them. Well, it's where we discovered that Tom could read, because he was reading to little baby Phil.
Tom, who was 4 or 5? 4.
He was 4, and he was reading a Peter Rabbit book, including Mr. McDonald coughing. And I thought, that's not a picture. And I've never read him that book. How does he know what that means?
It must have been exciting.
Well, it was a bit of an eye-opener,
Yeah.
because I don't know how he learned to read, but
Osmosis.
he certainly did. He was very capable before he hit preps.
Yep.
And in spite of the fact that we stayed there for 3 months,
I think it was
3
3
months.
months.
they're still really good friends, and we need to catch up with them. They live in Sydney. We have
They were on
caught
the
up with them
agenda.
in Norfolk Island, where they were for a while. But yeah, amazing that those friendships have.
Still 30 years of occasional
That's
physical
exciting.
contact, but yeah, it is nearly. It is 40 years, isn't it? Nearly
Wow.
38 years.
That's amazing.
So, how did you cover your cost of living? Like, how did you feed your horses and your kids? If, like, apart from people obviously handing things to you,
Little pots,
little pot.
Little
Little
pots were
pots.
the main. I think singing.
leather work.
Singing was sort of. I can remember sort of. I played in a couple of bands. That was good, but mainly little pots. Anna was the main person who got the money. Or I sold Anna's pots, and that was a major thing that people asked were, are you on the dole? And how do your kids get their education? Hey,
Yeah. Oh, we totally.
they were the big
responsible.
questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, we survived quite happily with the money that we had coming in.
Yeah, I mean, our expenses were food.
And people also occasionally dropped us a bale of hay. We bought
Pellets and
Pellets
chaff
for
for
the-
the horses.
and sometimes molasses for the horses. So we had to supplement their feed. So yeah, and paying the occasional blacksmith. Although that didn't happen very often. We had shoes made in Beechworth and shoes made in Arthur Judd
Parks.
in
Yeah,
Parks,
yeah.
which was another family group connection, and a guy further up in Queensland whose name I can't remember, but that was about the limit of the number of shoes that we needed. And the horses managed the trip up to Mullaney. I think we called out a vet once, which was because we discovered was an ant bite on one of our
Strider's
horses'
neck.
collar. But that was the extent of the problem the horses had, so they weathered it happily.
Yeah, and the vet that we got out was the cat and dog vet, who was scared of horses.
Yeah, he looked at our horses and said,
Stood on tiptoe.
"They're
and-
big, aren't they?" Yeah. So,
So just to kind of, because I could talk to you about your life all day because it's really interesting. But just to bring it to sort of forward to Dunolly.
Oh, that's right.
So I mean, like obviously that's an amazing adventure, and I just wonder what brought you to Dunolly itself. Like, what was attractive about this place?
Well, partly,
well, we haven't sold the wagon. We'd loaned the wagon to a friend, and she was going to drive the wagon back from Queensland to Melbourne, which she did amazingly rapidly. Took her about what? 6
but
weeks
the kids wanted to go to school.
Yeah, the kids were happy.
Right.
Were
They
keen to go to
they
school.
were really keen, and we felt that was probably not a big ask for them to do that. And we felt that Victoria was probably better for us to be in family-wise because we had connections still there, but we knew we didn't want to be in the city. We had one child who wanted a city, one who would be happy with 1 million acres, and one who really probably wasn't fussed. So a town seemed a bit of a compromise, and
we stayed for a while with
friends in St
friends in
Arnaud.
St Arnaud, which isn't that far away from Dunolly, and we started looking around to see where there might be a place we could rent, and there was a place
Because we were broke.
in Dunolly, which was the school property, and we went and had a look in Bendigo, but it was raining, so we decided we couldn't live there. We came back to Dunolly, and there was a place in Dunolly, which was a shop called, at that stage, the Currajong Gallery, or used to be called the Currajong Gallery, where I had visited on my going around taking pictures with students time. And we had a look at that place, and it didn't appear to be lived in, but there were burnt things exhibited in the window of the shop, which seemed a bit strange.
And there was a house joined onto
Here's the
it.
house. It looked like
and
it was
we
part
thought,
of the shop. Ooh, this looks interesting.
Nobody's
Who lives
living
there?
here, let's find out.
And
So
we
we did.
discovered when we talked to the people at the council offices just up the road that it was owned by the woman who was the head of the printmaking department of the Vic College of the Arts, B. Maddock. Oh, geez. And this all made sense because she had been burnt out in the Ash Wednesday fires at Macedon. So I burnt stuff in the window. Okay, that makes sense. So I rang B and she said, well, because of the bushfire situation and being burnt out in Macedon, her insurance was high and she needed to be visiting the place in Dunolly, which she had because she had got a job at the Bendigo
College of the Advanced
College,
Education
yeah,
at the time, now
as
the Trove.
printmaking, in being in charge of that or of the art department. So that's why she was in Dunolly, or had been in Dunolly, and now she was back in Tasmania. So she said she'd be really keen for us to rent the place here. And she actually came across from Tasmania and took her stuff out of the house and moved her things into where we now live, which was the little building next to the house. And she had been using her base in Dunolly for making paper and working from Dunolly in winter because she didn't like the winter in Tasmania and she preferred going back to Tasmania in summer because she could escape the heat in Victoria. So that worked out quite well. And eventually B was on a trip to Antarctica with a number of other prominent Australian artists, and she, getting off the ship, I think to get onto the mainland in Antarctica, fell and broke her leg. It took a while for that to be set properly because they did it on the ship, but it wasn't quite successful. And when she came back, she realised that getting around was not so easy and she decided to sell the Nolly. And by which stage we had established ourselves quite well.
My version of it is we had accumulated so much crap in the 5 years that we had been there that
There was
the
no
idea
choice.
of moving was
Yeah.
not particularly
And we also
pleasant.
discovered that Dunolly was a pretty good place to be. I'd always thought that it'd be really good to go somewhere and to do interesting stuff in a small community, small town. Because we had been travelling with the wagon through quite a few small places and we got to know what
Small towns
yeah,
were like.
and
Obviously,
met a lot
with
of people.
sort of you had to find your right sort of tribe, I guess.
Yeah. So when we arrived here, we started running some workshops.
Yeah. We used what was the shop space. We sort of started. I made contact.
Is it this same space that you're in now, or was this a different
No,
space?
it's the space 2 doors up.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was the house, and the shop, when B had it, was no longer being used as a shop, so that was another space that we had access to. She had an old printing press in there, but that was about it. So we had enough space there to run workshops over there. So she ran a paper making workshop,
Yep.
and I think she did a life drawing
She
class there.
did a life drawing class. Got somebody else in to do life drawing classes, but that was actually at the guide hall or scout hall.
Oh, okay.
But we did paper making. Lynn Fry did oil painting classes. Somebody else did fabric.
We
frame
organised some bush
colouring.
dancing and set up and
It
started
wasn't really decoupage.
doing some
Yeah,
music.
we did the bush dancing for the Gold Rush Festival and
We became quite involved. We also became involved in their music hall productions, singing
Yeah, with
and
the
dancing.
drama group that was on.
So we came fairly involved.
And was there much, apart from your friend B, was there much other art in the town? Is it like, was it an artistic town back then, or?
There were sort of elements of it. We
Yeah.
discovered that actually the people who had set up the Currajong Gallery were also potters from Ferntree Gully, near enough to where we'd been. And in fact, one of their things was Kate's teacher at Olinda School, one of their uncles, Geraldine Frawley.
What year did you arrive here?
85.
85. And what did your kids think about moving to Dunolly? What did they like the town, or?
I don't know that we asked them, actually.
Jono became involved in a number of things.
He joined the band.
Was he in
And
Scouts?
the Fire Brigade.
Fire Brigade.
Became a cub leader.
And were there many other kids? Like, did they go to local school, or was
Yes.
it?
Yeah.
Kate was actually at Dunolly Primary School for 6 months, I suppose, 6-7 months. And then secondary school was Maryborough.
Yep.
So Kate went to what's now Highview. She preferred that to the bigger schools of the High and the Tech at the time. John went to the Tech.
Tom was at Dunolly.
Dunolly.
And the only problem that existed in some ways with the education was that they were a bit too advanced.
Yeah.
So Tom was...
He was an avid reader, like Lord of the Rings was one of his things that he had just sort of...
And Tom would stop on the way home.
He could take an hour. He was allowed an hour to come home for what's really about a 10-minute walk at the outside.
Would he get distracted by things?
There's a
Lovely.
drain that runs under the road with a little bridge across it, and he used to like sitting there and reading. So he would sit there and read on his way home. And I think the space was really good for him, actually.
Yeah. And we did...
And I went off to university.
Ah, okay.
That was my
What did you study?
ceramics.
Ceramics.
Yes, so I did my Bachelor of Ceramics at Bendigo, which just expanded my pottery from 2 inch. My folio that I went in with for entry was in a cigar box. And one of the lecturers there had remembered me from Toowoomba.
From when you were
From
travelling?
when we were travelling with a wagon,
Oh, that's fantastic.
which was a bit of a hoot. He'd moved down the year before.
And I was freelance photographing, writing and photographing for magazines, newspapers, an amount. And when we got money, it was really wonderful. And I also started working for a mob in Melbourne, and actually ended up staying down there an amount which must have caused an amount of
Well, it was interesting.
problem for Anna doing the university thing and looking after the home while I was down there working my way into the wee hours, small hours of the night, either photographing or working with sound and with lots of projectors and doing gallery installations all over the place, doing quite exciting stuff, but away from here.
Yeah, it was interesting.
So it's been over 20 years? What, 20?
It's been 35 years.
35 years. 35
been here
years
for a while.
living here. So you're a town
In fact-
institution now, I would say.
It's half of my life.
Half of your life.
Has now been here.
Wow.
Close to half of my life too.